Here we are, the last lecture of the class, talking about humans. So this slide is a taxonomic categorization of modern humans. That's us. So this is essentially to introduce the idea of just of if we think of humans as any other evolved biological organism, what would we think about humans and how would we place them and how would we view their behavioral adaptations similarly to the way that we analyzed the behavioral adaptations of other animals. So this slide is who you are according to a biologist. Your kingdom Animalia, phylum Chordata, class Mammalia, order Primates, family Hominidae. Your genus is Homo, which is humans, so there are multiple species of humans. Anything in the genus Homo is a human. Your particular species is Homo sapiens. And so we've placed humans in this context of taxonomy, but to talk about their behaviors, there's a bunch of things that are topics that we'll cover that are, very unappealing and unattractive, awful things that humans do. So we're going to talk about the kinds of topics we talked about for non-human animals, such as foraging and mate choice, but we'll also talk about things like sexual conflict, including rape. We'll talk about infanticide. So there are certainly a number of truly awful things that humans do. And so if that's kind of topics are uncomfortable for you, then I hope you try to get through them. But what I'm letting you know now is that this lecture is kind of a bonus lecture. It's the idea if we apply evolutionary behavioral ecology to thinking to humans, what would that analysis look like? And again, it can be kind of uncomfortable. So these topics, I hope you find them interesting and excuse me, and in terms of changing, understanding and potentially changing and shaping human behaviors, I think it's important to understand how they came about from an evolutionary biology point of view, which is often very different from a sort of social psychological point of view. So these lecture material today will not actually be on the exam. So if you find this sorts of topic and discussion just too much, then you can skip it. That's fine. But like I say, I hope you find it interesting and potentially helpful in understanding and explaining and maybe changing human behavior going forward. So anyway, that's who you are, Homo sapiens, placed in this nested hierarchy of taxonomic categories. Who you are, why are you here? These are the big philosophical questions. Why you're here is because your ancestors reproduced. That's it. That's true for family members, and it's also true for your entire lineage back to the origin of life on Earth. So you're here because your ancestors reproduced. They were here because their ancestors reproduced back, through tetrapods and fishes and all eukaryotes back to origin of life on Earth. You're part of an absolutely unbroken chain of living organisms back to origin of life. That's pretty cool. That's also true for every other organism that's alive now, right? Everything alive now has an unbroken chain of ancestry back to the origin of life on Earth. That's an incredible success story in some sense, right? But as we know from selection, having successful ancestors doesn't necessarily mean that organisms will be successful in the current environment. The relative success or failure of those organisms is what we call selection, and it's their relative success or failure at reproduction. that's our currency of evolutionary fitness. So if we apply that fitness currency to human behaviors, we'll see how far we get. So one of the premises for this lecture is that there's no fundamental biological distinction between humans and other organisms, meaning we can apply the logic and analytics of evolutionary biology, descent with modification, natural and sexual selection, to humans. In other words, we could pretend we're biologists from Mars, just analyzing humans in the same way that we might analyze birds or insects or something else. There's also another important consideration within this lecture, is the premise that there's also no fundamental biological distinction within humans. In other words, this lecture is treating all humans as a single species that is recent, on the order of 150,000 years for Homo sapiens. It's been subject to a genetic bottleneck, so the amount of standing genetic variation within humans is actually very low, or relatively low. So in terms of different types of human populations around the world, we often analyze those differences because of their ecological circumstances are different, and they can tell us something perhaps about how humans evolved, but that's not to imply that there's any kind of important biological differences between different human populations. In other words, adaptations are applying to the entire lineage of modern Homo sapiens. So, topics and fitness related traits we examined in non-humans. We talked about optimality in terms of clutch size in birds. We talked about optimal foraging, food item selectivity. We talked about mate choice, sexual selection, sexual conflict, parental care, infanticide, kin selection. So we'll look at all those topics, at least indirectly, in humans, and sometimes the data and ideas might apply pretty well to humans, and sometimes they might not apply equally well. So, just to recap, reproductive output is what we call evolutionary fitness, total lifetime output of reproductive offspring, more correctly interpreted as inclusive fitness, right? Direct plus indirect reproduction. We know that selection always acts to increase fitness, and it does that by optimizing the different components of fitness. So we looked at clutch size in birds, and we saw that it approaches the optimum in terms of surviving young over the lifetime of the parent birds, not just in one particular season. So if you remember this graph, this is a frequency histogram of the distribution of clutch sizes, the number of eggs laid in the nest of great tits, with a modal value of 8 or 9 eggs. And we looked at the survivorship of offspring, recaptures per brood, and saw that there's a peak. The highest reproductive output is fairly closely matching what the birds typically do, and that there's some kind of optimality, highest fitness peak that's at some kind of intermediate value. So here's a graph showing similar kinds of things from a human population. This is the Kungsang, who are hunter-gatherers in the Kalahari Desert of southern Africa, Namibia, Botswana area. And human clutch size is typically just one. Sometimes there's twins, sometimes there's triples, but in terms of clutch size, basically human clutch size is 1. So instead of looking at the number of offspring as clutch size, we can look at what's called the interbirth interval, which is the number of months between having kid number 1 and kid number 2, the number of months between kid number 2 and kid number 3, so on and so forth. So the left panel, left axis shows the number of surviving offspring as a function of how they're spaced out in time, that interbirth interval. And that's this line here. And you can see that there's some kind of peak around 50-ish months. And then you can look at the distribution of what do the Kungsan women do in terms of spacing of their births. So that's this axis, the number of cases, which are all these bars down here. And what you see is that the distribution of those observed cases closely matches that peak of the optimal interbirth interval. It appears that physiologically that interbirth interval is regulated through the nursing of dependent offspring for a prolonged period. But at any rate, for our purposes, what we're seeing is a life history strategy where the observed interbirth interval matches what we would predict based on maximizing lifetime fitness in a way very analogous to the case in the birds we looked at. What about foraging? So if we look at non-human animals, we'd expect that humans would rank food choices based on caloric return, search time, handling time, perhaps risk, and that foraging proficiency would have fitness effects. It would be important to the reproductive output of humans. And this was tested in a series of studies by 2 anthropologists working with the Ache, who were a traditional hunting and gathering culture in Paraguay, South America. And they collected data on the foods that women and men collected versus ones that they ignored, and ranked them in terms of caloric return rate, calories per hour for different food items, and calculated an average foraging return rate. This is with walking time, so this includes the search cost versus average return rate without without searching. Basically, if you already have the resources, or if you're processing them at your home camp. And what you can see is that the vast majority of resources collected by women Ache are vegetable or plant materials. They like honey, different palm fibers, and so on. Females rarely forage for animal meat protein. The exception is armadillos in burrows or insect larvae, and that the ranking of those resources follows the expected caloric return. Now, the interesting contrast is with Ache men, who focus on hunting for animal protein. So here again is the mean foraging return rate, and all these food items that have this circle around them are things that men typically don't take. And what you can see from this slide is that there are a whole bunch of food items that have high potential return of calories per hour that men ignore, and instead they're going for the animal protein. So they're after high caloric honey, just like women, but in terms of animal proteins, deer and armadillo, peccaries, coatis are a sort of raccoon-like animal. Peccaries are sort of a pig-like animal, if you don't know. Pacas are a large rodent. So men are basically going out hunting for protein meats and ignoring high caloric return plant foods. So there's a question in terms of, clearly men are not maximizing caloric return. The calorie count isn't the key thing. For example, palm is encountered every 8 minutes. In 1 to 2 hours, palm would yield about 2,600 calories per hour, and men don't do that. Instead, they go hunting for these animal meat proteins with average returns less than half that. Less than. So does that mean, or does that suggest that men are not optimal foragers? Or alternatively, are men seeking out those animal proteins as an essential macronutrient for growing strong and healthy and having reproduction? So one interesting thing about what happens with the hunted animal foods is that the food from the hunt, the meat, is shared across the entire group. So you might expect that kin selection would make it so that successful hunters are directing the meat towards genetically related kin. Now, obviously, they're all genetically related to some degree, but close kin are not specially favored as food recipients from the hunt. Instead, it appears that men are distributing the protein meat in a way consistent with sexual selection. So here's the relationship between hunting and reproductive success in Ache men, and this is the number of surviving offspring based on whether they're for sure that hunter's offspring, maybe that's my kid, or combined. And the poor hunters are the dark bars, and the good hunters are these shaded bars. The shading is pretty dark, sorry. But what you can see in all cases, whether it's sure possible or all kids, the good hunters have more offspring than the poor hunters. In other words, the proficiency in hunting translates into reproductive success for good hunters, and there's selection on hunting ability that's perhaps mediated by some of that food sharing, being able to in effect trade meat and status as a hunter for reproductive access. So, speaking of reproductive access, this is a study in terms of advertising for mates that used modern human populations. It looked at the singles ads. This is the men seeking women, women seeking men type advertising in used to be in newspapers or magazines or something. Now it's all on Tinder or whatever. But there was an analysis done of those basically dating site ads that said, well, what do advertisers say they want in a partner? And it's divided into, does the ad mention, oh, I want my partner to be pretty good looking and attractive, or do I want my partner to have resources, money? And what you can see, when men are advertising for women, almost 45% of those ads said that the men were interested in an attractive woman, whereas ads put out by women, only maybe 20% said that they want a guy who's handsome or whatever, and a much higher percentage said that they want a man who's has resources, is financially stable or a good job or whatever. Not a deadbeat kind of guy. And then the flip side of that is what the advertising advertisers say they have, what they're claiming to offer. So about a third of men in their ad said that they're reasonably good looking, but a higher percentage said, I have money, I have resources, right? Women, 50% of the ads placed by women seeking male partners said that the woman assessed herself as an attractive person, and much lower percentage of the ads said that she has money or is financially stable or something like that. So that's consistent with some of our thinking from sexual selection about access to mating partners. Now, there's an interesting part of this study that was done with these dating ads, and part of the importance of this data is that it was done both in Arizona, so a Western, North American population, and in India. So that suggests that any commonality of results might be something about humans in general, not just the quirks of one particular culture. So this data set looked at how old the advertisers are, and then the age range that they say they're looking for. So what you see in both Arizona and in India is that young men say they want a female that is about the same age or slightly younger than they are. So a 20-year-old man in Arizona says he's interested in a woman from whatever that would be, 15 to 25 years old. Probably didn't advertise for a 15-year-old girl. That would get him in trouble. But maybe 18, someone close to his age. In India, there is a cultural difference. Men never advertised for a woman who was older than themselves. But if they're young, they also want a young woman who's similar in age to them. And then as the men get older, they are seeking a woman who's proportionally younger than them. So by the time the men are 40, they're seeking a woman who's maybe 25 or 30, which is that peak. Younger women have higher reproductive potential and higher fertility. So when men are young, they want a woman in peak reproductive years, also young, and as men get older, they still want a woman in peak reproductive years who's fairly young. Whereas if you look at what females say they want, in both Arizona and India, women, these ads placed by women say, it's fine if the guy's a little bit older than me, or always older than me in the case of India. But the difference here is that there's no change with the woman's age. These lines are flat, right? So a young woman or an older woman advertiser, there's no change in terms of the age of the partner they're seeking. It's always someone roughly their age or slightly older, which is a very different pattern from what you see in advertisements placed by men. So in terms of attractiveness, we can analyze what makes someone attractive or not. Clearly resources and money can make someone more attractive, but just in terms of physical looks, markers of potential good genes, sexual selection in humans body symmetry and facial symmetry and breast symmetry all appear to be very important um, indicators of how the phenotype developed um, uh, during ontogeny. So the idea behind the symmetry analysis is that the genotype for the left side and the right side, the genetic program is the same. So if development is not disturbed or perturbed, then we expect left and right sides in bilaterally symmetrical organisms to be the same or symmetrical. Whereas if there were um, disruptions during development, which could be environmental from food or an accident, or they could be genetic disruptions from certain genetic disorders, could interfere with the expression of the phenotype so that it ends up being asymmetrical. And that symmetry has been shown in lots and lots of studies to be an important attractive trait in both sexes. Other traits in males that are typically ranked as attractive are markers of testosterone, such as a square sort of jaw, longer face, strong muscles, stuff like that. And in females, similar kinds of traits are markers of estrogen during development, such as higher flat forehead, big lips. Um, those are markers of estrogen. So the insight into the reproductive condition of individuals is matched by some of these phenotypic traits that are typically ranked as attractive around the world, independent of culture. Lots of what we think makes people look good or not look good is, of course, just cultural. But if you focus on the things that are shared across many cultures around the world, you see these kinds of traits repeatedly ranked as attractive in humans. There's a cool study on the smell of good genes. We don't tend to think about attractive traits in sexual selection of humans as smell based, because humans in general have pretty poor sense of smell. But there are pheromones that people make and release in our sweat and body odors and things that are potentially informative about the good genes or genetic complementarity of those individuals. So there's a now fairly famous study that is called the T-shirt study, where they had the researchers had men wear the same T-shirt day after day, day and night, for I forget, I think 3 or 5 days, something like that. And then they put those T-shirts in bags, and they had women smell the T-shirts and rank the pleasantness of the male T-shirt smell, the male odors, and also their intensity. And so the women never met or even saw the men. It was just based on smell. And then they genotyped both the men and the women at their immune system alleles, what in vertebrates are called the major histocompatibility complex, MHC, are a whole diverse set of genes related to immune system diversity and function. In humans, the same set of genes is called the HLA, human leukocyte antigen, I think. But anyway, it's the same set of immune system alleles, and they analyzed the smell rankings of the females based on whether the MHC immune system alleles of the males and the females were either dissimilar or similar. And what you can see is that females ranked male t-shirt smells as more attractive if the males had immune system alleles that were different from the females. And if the male had immune system alleles that were similar to the females, then they ranked them as less attractive. And there's no effect for the intensity of the smell, just the pleasantness or attractiveness of the smell. So females are smelling male odors, male pheromones, and ranking them as more pleasant and attractive if they indicate immune system alleles that are different from the females, which would result in offspring that have high heterozygosity at their immune system alleles, which would obviously be potentially adaptive in countering a wide variety of pathogens. Now, that's these two left panels, A and C. They also analyzed the same set of data and got the exact opposite result over here in B and D, and where females ranked as more attractive, more pleasant, the odors of males with MHC alleles that are similar to the females, and as less attractive ones that were dissimilar. In other words, they got exactly the opposite result for some of the females. And the difference between these groups is that these ones on the left, where females are ranking as more attractive, males that have immune system alleles different than themselves, those were women that were having normal ovulatory cycles. The ones that are on the right were from women that were on birth control pills. So their hormonal system was regulated by birth control pills in a way that mimicked them being pregnant. And so they're finding more attractive the smells of individuals that are genetically similar to them if they're sort of in a state of simulated pregnancy, whereas if they're not in a state of simulated pregnancy, they're finding more attractive the smell of males that are dissimilar to them at their immune system alleles. Pretty fascinating stuff. More about mating systems in humans. Across different cultures, humans have essentially all mating systems possible. There are a number of monogamous cultures, a large number of polygynous cultures, and there are even 4 polyandrous cultures restricted to South Central Asia. And in these, the brothers will share a farm and share a wife rather than splitting the inherited farm. Instead, each of them getting half a farm, which is too small to support a family. Brothers will share a farm and share a wife in a polyandrous relationship. So there's a couple things that are interesting about that, just in terms of behavioral ecology, which is that it's the economic resources necessary to successfully get enough food to produce offspring. So that's like what in Helpers at the Nest we called an ecological constraint on these brothers' reproductive options. And then the fact that they're brothers. These polyandrous relationships involve some level of kin selection. It's not the case that it's 2 unrelated males that are sharing a farm and sharing a wife. It's genetically related kin that share a farm and share a wife in those polyandrous cultures, which is certainly consistent with behavioral ecology and kin selection and helpers at the nest kind of analyses in birds and other animals. Here's a graph of the mean number of reproductive wives per married year as a function of how much land uh, men owned in the Kipsigis tribe. And uh, clearly there's a positive relationship between, so this is within a polygynous culture. So within a polygynous culture, the number of wives is a increasing function of land wealth, which is again the resources, the ecology necessary to sustain reproduction. So that's no surprise, but it's certainly supportive data for this idea that the kinds of things we see in non-human animals apply to humans as well. Now, when we're talking about reproductive strategies, when lacking resources, lacking attractiveness, we can ask, is rape a conditional reproductive strategy? So just like we talked about sexual conflict in non-human animals, we could, and we talked about alternate reproductive strategies as fixed versus conditional, right? So a conditional reproductive strategy is the lower fitness option when the other alternatives are unavailable. And in the case of reproductive strategies in men, if forced copulation or rape is a conditional reproductive strategy, then we would predict that sometimes rape would have to lead to fertilization and reproductive success. We would predict that rapists would prefer to target younger women with high potential fertility. And if it's a conditional strategy, then it would predict that rape would be more likely in polygynous populations where there are fewer sexually available women. In other words, where the sort of ecological conditions make it so that a few men dominate reproductive access to most women, and that then rape would be a conditional strategy, making the best of a bad job in the way that we saw with salmon and a variety of other non-human animals. Now, this idea is very, very different from the current psychological view of why rape happens. Rape in the social sciences is generally viewed as a form of male aggression and male control over women, and that would lead to different predictions about when we might see the instances of rape be higher or lower. So there's some analysis that can contrast those ideas. Here's the first such analysis. If you look at the age of female crime victims versus the female population in general, to sort of have a null hypothesis of the distributions of potential victims of crime. So this is a frequency distribution across age of women, and this green line here is the age distribution of the female population as a whole. So, in other words, if rape was directed randomly towards women with respect to age, then you'd expect rape to follow this frequency of the age of women in the population, and it doesn't. The frequency distribution of rape in the population follows this line here, where there's a big peak around women of younger peak reproductive ages, and older women are very, very rarely raped relative to their proportion of the population. Now, you could argue that the female population as a whole is not a very good null hypothesis, because their older women might not be as sort of visible out and about in the population. So you could also compare the frequency distribution of the ages of rape victims with the ages of murder victims, which is more similar to rape in being a violent crime against women. And what you see is that the age distribution of female murder victims is in fact closer to the age distribution of female rape victims than it is of the female population as a whole. But nonetheless, the age distribution of rape victims is still shifted towards younger ages even than the frequency distribution of murder victims. And again, it's shifted to the areas of peak fertility and peak reproductive potential. Here's a graph across different cultures that shows the relative rates of rape versus the relative rates of divorce in different cultures. So they're relative rates because they're standardized at both to have a mean of 0. So these are cultures that have higher relative rates of divorce and ones with higher and lower relative rates of rape. And what you can see across all these cultures is there's a positive relationship where the incidence of rape is relatively higher in cultures that have relatively higher rates of divorce. And this is interpreted to reflect what's called serial monogamy. So even in cultures that would describe themselves as monogamous, if men and women are paired together monogamously when in their younger years and maybe have kids, and then get divorced later, and the male, for example, remarries a younger woman and has a second round of children with her, that's called serial monogamy. Serial meaning one after the other. So it's as though that male is polygynous, but just spread out over time. So monogamous with one partner, one set of kids, and then later in life monogamous with a different partner and a different set of kids. And that serial monogamy makes women, young women in particular, less available to other less successful or less attractive or less rich men. And so this increased rate of rape with increased rates of divorce is interpreted as reflecting the unavailability of young women for many of the men in the culture. What about parental care, infanticide, other aspects of reproductive trade-offs and conflict? So there's several topics that within this. We would expect parents to invest more heavily in their own genetic offspring from kin selection. If the probability of paternity is low, however, where inheritance wealth should go might reflect those probabilities of paternity. So if you're, you know, an old person deciding where to send your inheritance wealth after you die, if you give it to your son, the that son might be rearing offspring that are not genetically his, which would mean they're not genetically your grandkids. Whereas if the probability of paternity is low, your daughter's offspring will always be hers, so they will always be your grandkids. So if the probability of paternity is low, that should favor inheritance wealth going to daughters. Whereas if the probability of paternity is high, that could favor inheritance wealth going to either sons or equally to sons and daughters. And here's data from 70 societies around the world, divided by whether the probability of paternity is moderate to low or quite high, and whether the inheritance practice is matrilineal, meaning through females, through mothers to daughters, or patrilineal, fathers to sons. And these are the kind of data you'd run a chi-square on. I don't have the statistics, but obviously there's a very high likelihood that there's patrilineal inheritance if the probability of paternity is high, and matrilineal inheritance if the probability of paternity is moderate to low, which is, again, what we would expect based on kin selection theory and directing resources towards individuals who are more likely to be genetic relatives than individuals who are less likely to be genetic relatives. That was a cross-cultural comparison. If you just look at within a human culture in, you know, fully a population today, you can ask, does parental favoritism apply today in a way that is consistent with what we'd expect from kin selection? And so this was an analysis of whether or not kids get money for college depending on their family relationships. So this is controlling for wealth. Some families have more money to help support their kids through college and some have less. This controls for that and says, well, just what are the odds of receiving money for college if you're the genetic child of the current mate? You have a very high likelihood of getting money for college compared to a baseline probability. Whereas if you're the stepchild of the current mate, you have a somewhat reduced likelihood of getting money for college. And if you're the stepchild of a previous mate, so there's no kin effect and there's no current reproductive relationship, then the odds of getting money for college are really low. So you have a couple things applying here, not just kin selection. So there's obviously a genetic effect. Your own genetic child with your current partner has the highest probability. Your own genetic child, but from a previous relationship, actually has a higher probability of getting support than a non-genetic relative of a current partner. But the non-genetic relative of a current partner has higher likelihood than the non-genetic child of a previous partner. So there's both an effect of the current versus the previous mate, and the genetic versus non-genetic kin relatedness that applies in this directing of resources towards um, youth for college. What about human infanticide? Another awful topic to talk about. So we can ask ourselves, well, when might killing dependent offspring be in the reproductive interests of the social parents? So again, you know, fitness is lifetime reproductive output, inclusive fitness over the lifetime. Um, you would think killing infants would always be bad, but it depends on the future prospects of that child, and whether or not there's any kin selected effect, and whether or not that child having that, if there's a trade-off between current and future reproduction. So in the case of human infanticide, we might expect in terms of male infanticide of offspring is if it's not genetically theirs, they might be more likely to kill the child. If it's not likely to survive anyway, then not investing more resources in it might be to the reproductive advantage of both sexes, both male and female parents. Or if this trade-off between current and future reproduction, if the dependent young now, current reproduction, impair the mother's ability to gain future support and more and better provisioned future children. In other words, if, say, being a young single mother now makes it harder to find a future partner that you'd have future kids with, that's a trade-off between current and future reproduction that applies to females more than male. So across lots of different human cultures, the anthropologists analyzed whether or not infanticide occurred in a particular society, and the reasons that were given for infanticide occurring. So they were divided into three categories called inappropriate paternity, which is adulterous conception, non-tribal sire, or sired by the mother's first husband, which all of these categories of quote, inappropriate paternity can be understood in terms of the kin-selected relatedness of a social father to a non-genetically related kid. Poor infant quality is this idea that if the child is unlikely to survive and thrive anyway, regardless of how much is invested in them, then to maximize lifetime reproductive success, you wouldn't continue to invest more in an infant that is unlikely to survive anyway. So if they're deformed or very ill. And then the third category is the parental resources. For example, if there's twins, the birth is too soon or too many, no male support, the mother dies, if the mother is unwed, so lacking familial support or other economic hardship. And there's just an X in sort of lists of different cultures that the X means that culture gives this as a reason why infanticide sometimes occurs. And this study was done around the world: Africa, Asia, Europe, Middle East, North Africa, Oceania, Russia, South America. And what you can see totaled at the bottom is this numbers of different societies that list each of these potential reasons for infanticide, and clearly there's around the world, independent of culture, there are many instances in which inappropriate paternity or lack of kin selected effects are important. Many instances where the likelihood of the child surviving anyway is a reason, and things related to economics are also many times cited in different cultures as reasons for killing the dependent young. In modern infanticide, this is a now very famous study of homicide and child abuse in Canada, with the data are from the 1960s and 1970s. And so this is just a frequency histogram of the ages at which children were killed, which is the black or filled bars, versus the ages of all the children that were killed. So the ones in black were killed by their natural parents, whereas the ones in the clear bars or open bars were killed by somebody else. And what you can see is that the likelihood of being killed by your own parents is by far the greatest for very, very young children. And if you make it to late teenage years, then the risk you face of being killed is almost entirely from non-genetic relatives. So the infanticide from genetic relatives appears mostly confined to very young victims, where there's this real trade-off between current and future reproduction. Whereas if by the time you've made it to 16, 17 years old, that trade-off between current and future reproduction is really no longer in effect. Here's a similar kind of analysis, but based on the age of the mother. So the filled bars, the black bars, that's the age distribution of mothers that killed their own kids. And the dashed line distribution is the age distribution of mothers in the whole population, the ones that didn't kill their kids. So in other words, this is sort of the null distribution, and the black is the distribution of the ages of the women that did kill their kids. And what you can see is that the infanticidal mothers were significantly younger than new mothers in the population as a whole, which is again consistent with this idea of a trade-off between current and future reproduction, as well as a lower likelihood of economic resources to support that child to independence. Here's a table of kind of similar data, but what is different about this is it has step parents, or parent substitutes. meaning like a non-genetically related individual that's still in a family position. So this is victim's age. This is the number of children killed by someone that was in the role of a parent, is what that means. And then B, this is the percentage of these cases where it was effectively a step parent. So this is all parental roles, and this is the ones that are not genetically related individuals. So there's no kin selected effect or benefit in the offspring of these murderers. So these step parents, you can see there's a much, almost 20-25% of the very young age 1, 2, 3, 4 children that were killed by a step parent as compared to a genetically related parent. And Daly and Wilson sort of extended the conclusions of that study and found that child abuse in general was 40 times more likely in step-parent families than in families where both genetic parents were present. That doesn't mean child abuse was rampant. The overall risk of abuse was still rather low in these Canadian population, 1960, 1970. But there's a 40 times higher likelihood of abuse when the kin selected genetic relatedness component is not present. What about abortion? Abortion is kind of like infanticide before the kid gets there, right? It's the termination of reproductive investment in a current sort of pre-offspring, a current potential reproductive episode. And these are data from England and Wales that show the percentage of pregnancies aborted as a function of the female's age and whether or not she's single or married. So what you can see is that young married women are very unlikely to abort a fetus as compared to young single women, and that then it becomes about equal rates in the late 30s to 40s. And then older married women are actually more likely to abort a pregnancy than single women that were in their late 40s. So the interpretation here was that young married women were more likely to have stable partners and resources suitable to successfully rear those offspring than young single women were, and that those young single women had the potential for future reproduction. They might stop being single. They might marry somebody, meet somebody, marry somebody in the future. So the young single women faced a trade-off between current and future reproduction, whereas the young married women had resources to support those current pregnancies. But then if you're still single by the time you're middle-aged, then you're more likely to just keep that kid and raise that kid on your own. And so the authors of this converted those probabilities of abortion uh, and analyzed them in terms of the probability of future marriage. So this is the for these single women, if the probability of future marriage was higher than the probability of abortion now is higher than if the probability of future marriage is low. That's the difference between these females and these females. So again, it seems to follow what we'd expect in terms of a trade-off between current and future reproduction and maximizing lifetime reproductive inclusive fitness. This is actually prevalent enough. When we talked about infanticide in non-humans, we mostly talked about examples of male infanticide, like in lions and langur monkeys and stuff like that. And I think it's a prevalent idea in our cultures that there's this maternal instinct and that males are more violent and dangerous and all these sorts of things. But the abandoning of offspring by young single women without the sufficient resources or family support to rear them is actually high enough in the U.S. that laws have now been enacted to legalize what are often called baby drop-offs. So there are thousands of babies in the U.S. Each year that are effectively abandoned by young mothers, enough that the majority now of U.S. states have made it legal, sort of no questions asked, to rather than abandon or kill the offspring, to give it into like a fire station is often one of those places that it's legal to, no questions asked, leave a young dependent child. Whew. So that's a lot of gnarly stuff. What do we conclude from all this? I certainly conclude that human behavior evolved under the same kinds of evolutionary rules as other species, and that relevant rule is, natural selection and inclusive fitness. But it's also important to think about what we conclude in a broader sense about some of these really awful things that humans do, right? The fact that we can understand some of these awful things that humans do as potentially adaptive for the individuals that do them, that doesn't mean they're good or justified. That doesn't excuse them, right? The understanding of evolutionary fitness outcomes, we should never draw moral influences from natural selection and evolution. Natural selection and evolution is just an analysis of under what circumstances do certain genes spread through a population. That doesn't mean anything about morality. It's just, will the genes increase in frequency in a population or not? And then it's also, of course, important to understand what we mean by genes influencing behavior and genes spreading through a population. None of this should be interpreted as, oh, like there's a gene for infanticide, or there's a gene for rape, for example. That's not the correct conclusion. The genes often predispose the expression of behaviors under certain circumstances. And it's those certain circumstances that are sort of the ecological backdrop for the expression of um, fitness alternatives in behavior. So under one, the genes that might really spread through a population are the genes that say under this circumstances do this, and under these other circumstances do that, and that they're predisposing individuals towards certain types of behaviors. There's not any kind of one-to-one correspondence between genetic variation and behavioral phenotypic variation. It's often facultative, it's often moderated through our emotions, and that our emotions are can be understood as adaptive traits that can make us, feel more connected with somebody and more likely to invest in offspring with them, or jealous of somebody. Those kinds of feelings are strong motivators of behavior, and those kinds of feelings are determined in part by circumstances and in part by genes that influence um, brain processing of signals and behavior and resources. So, on that fun note, that's it.